from Saturday morning at 8 until Monday morning at 8 Eastern. Next, a look at two books on guns in America. We begin with this book, More Guns, Less Crime, Understanding Crime and Gun Control Laws by John Lott. It's an update of his 1997 study in the Journal of Legal Studies showing that concealed weapons permits reduce crime. Mr. Lott talked about his book at 57th Street Books in Chicago. Following this, we'll have Tom Diaz, author of the book Making a Killing, The Business of Guns in America.
Good evening, and welcome to 57th Street Books. Thanks for braving the snow and the weather that we've been dealing with here in Chicago. I'm glad you all could be here. My name is Leah Schweitz, and I'm the Assistant Events Coordinator with the Seminary Co-op Bookstores. And tonight's lecture is part of an ongoing series that we do here at 57th Street Books, at the University of Chicago, and at the Newberry Library. If you're interested in being added to our mailing list, feel free to fill out one of these request forms, and you can hand it to me after the event. Tonight, I am pleased to introduce Professor John Lott, Jr. Professor Lott is the John M. Olin Visiting Law and Economics Fellow at the University of Chicago, where he teaches criminal deterrence, law, and economics. He was the chief economist at the United States Sentencing Commission in 1988 and 1989. In addition, Professor Lott has authored more than 70 academic articles. Tonight, he will be speaking on and answering a few questions about his latest book, More Guns, Less Crime, Understanding Crime and Gun Control Laws. Please help me welcome Professor John Lott.
Well, thank you very much for that nice introduction. I'm going to give a short talk, and then afterwards I'm happy to take whatever questions you all have. Now, there are obviously lots of bad things that happen with guns, but guns can also prevent bad things from happening. And I think no matter what different views people hold on the issues of guns, there's one concern that unites us all, and that's does allowing law-abiding citizens to own guns or carry guns save lives or cost lives? And what effect does it have on the threats that people face every day from crimes like rape, robbery, and aggravated assault? And we hear about guns constantly in the news media, and maybe we could say that in some sense Americans are obsessed with guns. But a lot of what passes as fact these days simply isn't true. And we hear about the horrific events that happen with guns, the horrific crimes, and the massive news coverage that they receive, as they should. However, the news media doesn't give equal weight to the bad things that are prevented with guns. There's 16 national surveys that show that at least 2 million times a year, people use guns in order to prevent bad things from happening. The vast majority of these times, about 98% of the time, simply having to brandish a gun is sufficient to cause a criminal to break off an attack. But dramatic stories of women who brandish a gun in order to prevent a carjacker from kidnapping her children in the car, seldom even make the local news. Cases where public shootings or bombings are stopped by citizens with concealed handguns or other weapons similarly are lucky to make the local news, let alone national news. This asymmetry is somewhat understandable. I mean, if something bad happens, if somebody's killed or injured, it's understandable why that's likely to get front-page news coverage. Cases where a woman may simply brandish a gun and a criminal may run away. You know, if nobody's harmed, if the would-be rapist simply ran away and the woman wasn't touched in any way, it's understandable why that may not get front-page news coverage. It's not going to be as exciting to say, criminal approached victim and ran away. But if we're going to be asking the question about the policy concerns, what are the net benefits or net costs of having people own guns? Just as we would want to count the bad things, the murders or other crimes that are going to be committed with guns, we'd also want to count the crimes that never occurred because people were able to defend themselves with guns. Unfortunately, I think these existing misimpressions have real costs. Many of the myths that people believe, I think, needlessly frighten them and prevent them from using what in fact turns out in many cases to be by far the most effective means for them to defend themselves and their families. And I like to go through just a few myths here that I think actually endanger people's safety. The first one is, when someone is attacked, passive behavior is the safest course of action. And we hear that constantly in reading the press. And there's a kernel of truth to it. If you look at something like the National Crime Victimization Survey, if you compare passive behavior to all forms of active resistance lumped together, you in fact find that passive behavior is a slightly safer course of action for people to take than active resistance. The problem is, all sorts of things are being lumped together in that one broad category of active resistance. It's including things like using one's fists in order to resist an attack, to yelling and screaming, to running away, to using a baseball bat or mace or a knife or a gun. And those different types of actions have huge differences in terms of their effectiveness. Particularly for a woman, to go and use one's fists is a very dangerous course of action to take. That you're virtually always talking about a male criminal attacking a female victim, and there's a large strength differential that exists there. And for a woman to go and use her fists in that type of situation is very likely to result in a physical response back from the criminal and result in serious injury to the woman. So you're lumping together that along with these other types of actions which turn out to be much safer. In fact, if you look for either men or women, by far the safest course of action for people to take when they're confronted by a criminal is to use a gun. Women who behave passively when they're confronted by a criminal are 2.5 times more likely to end up being seriously injured than women who have a gun. For men, the effect isn't as dramatic, but it moves in the same direction. Men who behave passively are about 1.4 times more likely to end up being seriously injured when they're confronted by a criminal than men who resist the confrontation with a gun. Another myth that we hear a lot about is that friends or relatives are the most likely killers. And this myth is usually based upon two claims. The first is that about 50% of murderers involve so-called acquaintances. And the second one is that anyone can be a murderer. This is an example where certain terms are used, and we kind of think what acquaintance means to us. But when people have put together these statistics, they're using the term acquaintance in a quite different way than I think most of us think. We think an acquaintance is probably a friend or a relative or somebody like that. In fact, the vast majority of acquaintance murderers are rival gang members killing each other. If you have two gangs that are next to each other in a city, it's quite likely that the gang members from each of those gangs know each other. And if they get into some type of gang war, a gang fight over trying to control drug turf there, that would then be classified as acquaintance murders. Acquaintance murders include things like drug buyers killing drug pushers, cab drivers killed by first-time customers who may have only been in their cab for 2 seconds. The way the FBI looks at that is that there was a potential financial relationship that existed between the cab driver and this person who went in the cab, and so they classified that as an acquaintance murder. You have prostitutes either killed by their pimps or by their johns. All those things, and I could go on in the list, are crimes, murders, that would be classified as acquaintance murders. Chicago is really the only city that breaks these types of murders down in a fine enough way so that we can get at a lot of I think what a lot of people think of when they think of acquaintance murders. And if you look at all the murders between 1990 and 1995 in Chicago, 17% of murders could be classified as either involving family members, friends, neighbors, or roommates. So even when you include something like neighbors, which is a fairly broad classification there, you're still talking about something that's dramatically less than I think what we hear constantly in the media. The other thing is, the other part of this notion is who commits murders. Because I think one of the things about this myth is that it makes us needlessly afraid of those around us. The point of this myth is that we shouldn't trust anybody with a gun because anybody in kind of the heat of the moment might turn into a potential murder. In fact, when you look at it, murders are not committed by anything that remotely approaches your average citizen. For example, 90% of adult murderers are people who already had adult criminal records. You see a similar percentage for juveniles. Murders are overwhelmingly committed by young males with low IQs who have a long history of social problems with others. They occur in very geographically isolated areas. 80% of the counties in any one year in the United States have 0 murders. Another myth out there is that the United States has such a high murder rate because Americans own so many guns. There's really no international evidence to back this up. This claim is based upon a comparison that usually involves about 4 or 5 or 6 different countries at most. We've got data on dozens of countries, and why one would only pick a few countries to make a comparison with isn't exactly obvious. And there's lots of problems in making comparisons with regard to international crime data. The only way we know about gun ownerships in different countries is through surveys and polls, and there's problems that we can talk about in the question session about that. But what's usually left out of these 5 or 6 countries which the comparison is made are countries like Israel, for example, which owns guns or has gun possession at much higher rates than we have here in the United States. Other countries that have gun ownership rates similar to what we have here in the United States, such as Switzerland or Finland or New Zealand. All countries which have very high gun ownership rates but have very low murder rates. Switzerland, for example, has a lower murder rate than any of the countries that it shares a border with. Its gun ownership rate is about 2.5 times higher than Germany's, and yet its murder rate's about 40% lower. New Zealand has about twice the gun ownership rate that Australia has, but its murder rate's about 1/3 lower. You could look at a country like Israel, as I mentioned, which has one of the highest gun ownership rates in the world. Its murder rate's about 40% below even a country like Canada's. When you look at U.S. data, which allows us to control for a lot of things that you can't control for in international data, you in fact find that those states in the United States which have had the biggest increases in gun ownership rates over time have actually had the biggest drops in violent crime over that same period of time. Another myth is that the family gun is more likely to kill you or someone you know than to be used to kill in self-defense. And there are a couple studies which have made this claim. They either look at 1 city or 3 cities within 1 single year. And there are a lot of problems I could go into, but I think 2 problems with this sum it up. But this is essentially a survey that's been done of people, of relatives of people who have been killed and or injured near a home. And the problem is, one of the questions they ask is was a gun owned in the home where this person was killed? They never really asked, though, whether or not it was the gun in the home that was used in the killing. And when, in fact, people have tried to look back at this later on, they found that at most 4% of the guns that were attributed to being responsible for that death were, in fact, responsible. 96% of the deaths that have been attributed to the gun in the home were, in fact, due from a killer who brought in a gun from the outside. So that's one bias. The other bias is making the comparison to how frequently a gun is used in order to try to kill an intruder there. And what that does is it minimizes greatly the benefits that are there because, as I mentioned before, in the vast majority of times, about 98% of the time, people merely need to brandish a gun in order to cause a criminal to break off an attack. So you're only, and even in that 2% where it's fired, in less than 2%, the vast majority of those are warning shots. So you're only talking about something like about 1/2% of the time where the gun's even fired at the criminal directly, and only a fraction of those result in the death of the criminal. So when you concentrate on only those cases where the attacker is killed, you're leaving out 99, +% of the cases where an attack was prevented by somebody simply being able to brandish a gun or firing a warning shot. My own research indicates that on net, and I'll talk about this more as we go on net guns save quite a few lives. A 5th myth and the last one of these major myths I'm going to go into, is the notion that gun locks will save lives. I have a feeling that most people think that accidental gun deaths in the United States, particularly among children, are much more frequent than they actually are. In 1996, 30 children under the age of 5 and 200 children under the age of 15 died from all types of accidental gunshots. I mean, that represents a real cost of gun ownership. There's no two ways about it. But I think a couple things need to be kept in mind. The first thing is, we're talking about 80 million people in the United States, give or take about 4 or 5 million people, own guns, own something between 200 and 240 million guns. It's hard to think of any other item that we have in the home that's anywhere near as common as guns or as dangerous that has such a low accidental death rate that's associated with children. And you can think of things like cars. You have about, in 1996, for children under 15, there were about almost 3,000 children who died in motor vehicle crashes. You had about 950 children who drowned in pools and in boating accidents. You had over 1,000 children who died from residential fires. Hundreds more children died in bicycle accidents in 96 than died from all types of firearm accidents. And there's even more amazing comparisons that you can make. You have more children who, under the age of 5, who die from drowning in water buckets in the home than die from accidental gunshots. You have about 5 times more children under the age of 5 who die from fires that they start with cigarette lighters each year than die from all types of accidental gunshots. I'm a father of 4. I can't imagine what it would be like to lose one of my children for any reason, let alone an accidental gunshot. But the puzzling thing to me, and maybe somebody else has an answer to this because it's something that I haven't been able to figure out completely, is why this one particular type of death among children gets so much more news coverage than so many other things that are much riskier for children. You know, one thing somebody could go and argue is that, well, maybe these are rare events. They're unusual in some way. Well, I mean, you have things like young children who die in these water buckets that we were talking about before. That's something which is fairly similar in numbers, but my guess is I can't even think of a time. I can't even find a time on the national news, if you go through and do Nexus searches, where that type of incident is talked about. Now, I know it's hardly consoling to go and say that, look, there are common fixtures around the home where children die at higher rates than guns. I mean, that's something that isn't very satisfying in one important sense. But I would say I think it emphasizes something, though, or illustrates a point. And that point is, we understand with pools or with space heaters, with pools we could eliminate drownings tomorrow if we banned pools, if we made it illegal for people to have pools around the home. But we understand that there's a trade-off there. We understand that if we got rid of pools, there wouldn't be the drownings. But on the other hand, people wouldn't be getting the exercise that they otherwise would have gotten. And that's going to affect people's health and life expectancy. And we understand the trade-off that exists there. The same thing with space heaters. We could get rid of that. We wouldn't have a lot of these residential fires that occur, but people would be cold, they'd get sick during freezing weather, such as we're having now in Chicago. And there'd be real costs to getting rid of those space heaters. And what I would argue is that that same type of trade-off exists in guns, but for some reason we haven't been talking about it. I mean, we have the costs on the one hand of these accidental gun deaths, but it's not costless to go and mandate that people go and have to have locking devices on their guns. You have a suit now in New Orleans against gun makers, which is trying to argue that gun makers should be required to have special electronic locks on their guns that can only be activated with a fingerprint, or if you have a special ring that has a computer chip in it. And those things are going to add hundreds of dollars easily at the most conservative estimate to the price of a gun. But even less exotic types of locks, like trigger locks or barrel locks, also have costs. If somebody lives in a very dangerous area, it may be costly for them to have a gun locked in a way that it's not going to be readily available to them if, in fact, an intruder comes into their home. And also, my concern when we talk about more expensive types of blocks especially, is the impact that that's going to have on relatively poor people who live in high crime areas. I mean, my research indicates very strongly to me that it's poor people who live in these high crime areas which benefit the most from being able to have a gun to protect themselves and their families. The other thing that I think is important is that by exaggerating this particular type of risk, by having the national news stories concentrate on this so much, what I think it does is it creates a certain type of fear for people owning guns in the home. And what that does is that makes it so because of this fear, people don't have guns around even when it would be the most effective means for them to defend themselves and their family. That you know, we get information from the news, and because the news concentrates so heavily on the bad things that happen, people get a warped impression of the costs and benefits of having a gun around the home. Now, what I try to do in my book is look at a whole range of factors that affect crime rates. Everything from arrest rates to conviction rates to prison sentence lengths, changes in illegal drug prices. I have extremely detailed demographic data. I control for a range of different types of penalties, other types of penalties, gun control laws, hundreds of different types of factors, income, poverty, unemployment. I could go through the list. On the range of gun control laws I look at things like state waiting periods, state background checks, the federal version of those laws with the Brady Law, penalties for using guns in commission of crimes, as well as something called right to carry concealed handgun laws. And the only one that I find that really produces any beneficial impact is the passage of these right to carry laws, which allow citizens, if they meet certain objective criteria, so they're a certain age, they pass a criminal background check, about half the states require some type of training. But once they meet those objective criteria and they apply for a permit, then it's automatically granted. And I'll talk about that more in a second. I also look at things about how total gun ownership is related to crime rates and accidental gun deaths and suicides. And the bottom line, I think very strongly, is that on net, gun ownership saves lives. Now, I'm not going to go into it too much in detail, but I want to talk for a few minutes about concealed handguns, because as my research progressed, originally I was going to look at a whole range of gun control laws, but as I found that concealed handguns seemed to be the one case where we were finding a benefit that was produced, as you'll see, the book concentrated more and more on that as I found the evidence seemed to single that out as a particular beneficial policy. And I think also the thing about concealed handguns is that it really puts into sharp focus the debate about guns. To gun control advocates, I think the argument about concealed handguns is pretty straightforward, and the notion is that if you introduce a gun into a violent encounter, it's more likely that someone's going to die, that in the heat of the moment, someone will pull out their concealed handgun and they'll use it to go and kill somebody else. And also the concern is that as we have more guns around, we'll see increases in accidental gun deaths. The other side of this debate points to the fact, well, bad things do happen, but concealed handguns can also be a deterrent. That criminals like to attack victims that they perceive of as relatively weak. And one of the benefits of concealed handguns, as opposed to open carry, is that criminals won't know until they actually attack a would-be victim whether that person's going to be able to defend themselves or not. Now, there's a range of different types of questions one can talk about. Some of the simplest effects of concealed handguns you can look at is simply to see, do the people that we let have these concealed handgun permits pose a risk themselves? And one thing that you find over and over again in these states is that the type of person who's willing to go through the process to obtain a concealed handgun permit tends to be extremely law-abiding. These people lose their permits for any reason, and the vast majority of these cases are, what I think one would argue, are very trivial, at only hundreds or thousands of 1 percentage point. I'll give you one example with Florida. Between October 1st, 1987 and December 31st of 1997, Florida had issued over 444,000 permits. During that period of time, 84 licenses had been revoked because of firearms-related crimes committed by license holders. But even that 84 greatly exaggerates, I think, the risk there when we talk about crimes committed, firearms crimes committed by license holders, because about 3/4 of that 84 were because of people who accidentally carried a gun into an airport or into a school or some other type of restricted area. You know, you may have heard about a year or so ago about the former coach of the Dallas Cowboys, who's no longer a coach there, who accidentally carried a concealed handgun into the Dallas-Fort Worth airport. And he was in a rush. He simply ran into the airport quickly, forgot that he had the gun with him, and he was arrested for that. That would be a type of violation which would be sufficient for someone to go and lose their permit. No one would be saying that he posed a threat to other citizens at the airport or anyplace else. And you see similar types of experiences in other states. One of the things that's also interesting is to see the level of police support for these concealed carry laws. If you look nationwide, about 76% of street officers and 59% of managerial officers support citizens being able to carry concealed handguns. And even those that had opposed it, it's interesting to see how their views changed after these types of laws were adopted. I'll just give you a few quotes. This past December, Glenn White, the president of the Dallas Police Association, said, quote, "I lobbied strenuously against the law in 1993 and 1995 because I thought it would lead to wholesale armed conflict. That hasn't happened. All the horror stories I thought would come to pass didn't happen. No boogeyman. It's all worked out very well, and that says good things about the citizens who have permits. I'm a convert." And I can give you other quotes if you're interested. Now, if you read the legislative debates on concealed handguns, there's two things that come out continuously. One is this notion that in the heat of the moment, someone's going to use a permanent concealed handgun to shoot somebody else. And the one case that's always brought up is the notion of a traffic accident. That after one of the pickup trucks got out, started pummeling the other driver through the open window of his cab, broke his jaw, fractured his cheekbone, detached his retina, and was continuing to pound away at the one driver. And it was only at that point, when the driver who was being attacked started getting pulled out through the open window of his cab, that the person who was being attacked pulled out his permanent concealed handgun and shot the person that was attacking him. The other concern that's brought up in all the legislative debates is the safety risks that permanent concealed handguns might pose to police officers. And we hear every year about cases where police officers accidentally shoot other police officers. And the concern is that that type of risk will merely be magnified if we allow citizens, law-abiding citizens, to carry concealed handguns. And yet again, despite all this experience that I'm mentioning with these states having these laws for as long as 60 years and the millions of people with these permits, there's been no instance where someone with a permit has killed a police officer. There have been 45 cases, though, where citizens with permits have come to the aid of police officers, and a couple dozen of which, in which the police officers themselves say that they would not be alive today if it wasn't for the citizen who was there when there was no police backup around who was able to go and defend the police officer. Now, what I do in my book is I look at crime data as well as accidental gun deaths and suicide rate data for all 3,000 plus counties in the United States over an 18-year period of time from 1997 to 1994. And as I mentioned, I try to control for a range of other factors. And what I find is that the most important determinants for affecting how crime rates change over time are arrest rates and conviction rates. There's absolutely no doubt the police are extremely important in reducing the crime rate, if not the most important factor. But the thing is, the police can't be there all the time. and you have a couple questions that come up. In fact, in the vast majority of cases, police arrive on the crime scene after the crimes occurred. And what you find, as I mentioned earlier, is that the most effective means for people to behave, the way people behave when they're confronted by a criminal, is to use a gun. And also maybe a gun might be able to deter criminals from attacking to begin with. And so one thing that I look at is how these crime rates change before and after the passage of these right-to-carry concealed handgun laws. And what this graph basically shows you here is how this deals with violent crime rates as a whole, changed before and after the adoption of laws. This line up the middle here shows you the year in which the concealed handgun law was adopted. The points to the left of this shows you what the violent crime rates were in the years preceding the adoption of the law. And these are the violent crime rates after the law has been adopted. And this is after already accounting for things like changes in arrest rates and conviction rates and national changes in violent crime rates. And what you find is that the violent crime rates were falling and then slightly increasing right up until the point where the concealed handgun laws were adopted. It then quickly leveled off and then began to fall. And one thing you'll see with these graphs is how the size of the drop increases over time. And you'll basically see that across all these graphs. And the reason is very simple, and that is when you pass one of these right-to-carry laws, everybody who's going to get a permit doesn't instantly go out and get it. It takes many years. I'll give you an example, like Florida. The first year after Florida passed its right-to-carry law, you had about 33,000 people with permits. About 4 years after, you had 67,000. About 10 years after, you had 194,000, and now you have about 220,000 people that have permits. And if the risks that the criminal faces depend upon the percentage of the adult population that have these permits, and if he's deterred by that increased risk, you would expect then that as a greater percentage of the adult population has these permits, you're going to see a bigger reduction in the violent crime rate. And in fact, that's what you observe. Here's murder rates. It's fairly flat right up until the point where these right-to-carry laws were adopted. Very slight increases, and then it begins to fall right at that point. Not a couple years before or after, but right at that point in time. For rapes, the rape rates were fairly flat, slightly falling, and then very slightly increasing right up until the point in time that these right-to-carry laws were adopted. And then you saw a very large precipitous drop in the rape rates that started right at the point in time that these concealed handgun laws were passed. And for robbery, there's a very dramatic graph here. Robbery rates were increasing very dramatically right up until the point in time where these right-to-carry concealed handgun laws were adopted and then began to fall after that point. Now, just describe a couple of the other main results that I got here, and that is these are overall average drops, but what you find is that the biggest drops in violent crime occur in the most crime-prone, urban, heavily minority, poor areas in this country. Places where people are threatened by crime at very high rates. Turns out it's not too surprising that those are the people who benefit the most from being able to defend themselves. I also found that women benefited much more from concealed handguns than men do. And that fits in with the earlier discussion that I mentioned, too, about the differences between men and women being able to defend themselves with guns. And I think it all fits in, and there's other types of similar numbers I can give you. But it all fits in with one general fact, and that is, in the case of women, when you're talking about male criminals, you're talking about a large strength differential between the would-be attacker and the victim there. And the presence of a gun represents a much bigger change in a woman's ability to defend herself than it does for a man. And one of the other things you find is that not all crime rates seem to fall, though. There's some evidence that you see slight increases in some categories of crime, in particular larceny. And what seems to be happening is that when you pass these concealed handgun laws, criminals stop committing crimes like robbery, as we saw dramatically here, and switch into other crimes where there's no longer contact between the victim and the criminal. So in the case of larceny, just so you all know, those are crimes involving stealth. Those are crimes like theft of a tape deck from an unattended car, where the presence of a concealed handgun won't matter because the victim and the criminal don't come into direct contact. So what seems to be happening here is that those crimes where there is contact become riskier for the criminals. Criminals commit fewer of those crimes and start committing some other crimes, so where it's relatively safer now for them to commit them. Now, there's another type of substitution that you see, not only between different types of crimes, but between areas. And I think one way to illustrate this is to make a reference to the club that many people put on their cars. You know, if you put a club on your car, that doesn't mean that the number of auto thefts is going to be reduced by the number of people who put clubs on their car. What could simply happen is that when an auto thief gets into an area, he sees your car, sees a club on it, and then moves over to some other place in the parking lot and steals a car that doesn't have a club on it. And you may see a similar type of thing that could occur with regard to law enforcement. If you increase law enforcement in one area, the crime rates could fall there, but some of the criminals who would have committed the crimes there may move to other areas to go and commit crimes. And in fact, that's exactly what you observe with these concealed handgun laws. This graph here is for murders. What this looks at, and I probably should have drawn a line in the same place that I did in the previous graphs, but year 0, again, here is the year that they passed the law, and year 1 is the first full year that the law is in effect. And what this shows you are murder rates in border counties and neighboring states without the law. So when I pass a concealed handgun law in my state, remember, just keep in the back of your mind the graphs that I just showed you a minute ago and how your murder rate falls. What you observe, though, in the border counties and the neighboring states that don't have these laws is that right at the same time that your murder rate's falling, you see an increase in the murder rate in these border counties and the places without the right to carry laws. It's only about a quarter as large as the drop that you observe, but it's interesting just to see the timing. And this is for rapes. On average, the rape rates in border counties and neighboring states without the law was falling right up until the point in time when their neighbor passed these right-to-carry laws. And then at that point, their rape rates began to go up. And again, it's only a fraction of the size of the drop, but it's just in the state that passes these laws. But it's just interesting to see the timing. I mean, this increase didn't start 2 years earlier or 3 years later, but it started at the same time that you began to observe the drop in the place that passed these right-to-carry laws. And the same thing with robbery here, right? This is when they passed the law in the border neighboring state, and this is what happens in the state without these laws. And one other thing I'll just point out, though, is you see the biggest drops in both states when they both pass the right-to-carry law. And that seems to be a very consistent fact across the different types of crime categories. Now, I'd like to spend just a couple minutes ending on something that gets a lot of attention, and I think understandably so, and that's so-called multiple victim public shootings. You know, when we think about it, I'm sure a lot of the worst shootings over the last 25 years come readily to mind. I mean, we had the school shootings that happened this last year. And, you know, I'll just list a few. You have the Colin Ferguson shooting in '93 on the Long Island Railroad, in which 6 people were killed. You have the 1991 Luby's Cafeteria shooting in Killeen, Texas, in which 22 people were killed. 5 people died at the Cleveland Elementary School in Stockton, California in January '89, and 21 people died at the San Ysidro, California McDonald's in July 1984. And I've had the chance over the last couple of years, the opportunity to talk to some of the people who have been at these shootings, and the feelings of utter helplessness that people feel when gunmen methodically shoot their cowering prey is pretty overwhelming. And when you talk to these people, you can kind of understand, because of the terror, why these get the type of news attention that they do, even though they involve just a tiny fraction, just hundredths of 1% of the number of murders that occur in the United States. And one of the questions I try to ask in the book is what might society try to do in order to try to reduce these types of mass killings? If you look across countries, we've observed instances around the world the last few years in particular where there seems to be a pretty common solution to that, and that's the passage of more regulations. You have the shootings in Tasmania, Australia, or Dunblane, Scotland, where many types of guns have been outlawed as a result of those shootings. And even in the United States, you've had calls, for example, after the 1997 shooting at the top of the Empire State Building, in which one person was killed, where Mayor Giuliani would use that event to go and call for national gun licensing rules. And there are other laws, such as waiting periods, which have been called for in the past and have been passed as a result of these types of shootings. Yet the response hasn't been uniform across all countries or in the United States. In Israel, for example, after a lot of the terrorist shootings in the 60s, one of the changes that you observed is the great liberalization of concealed carry laws. If you read news accounts back from the 60s in Israel, it seems like every month at least, and frequently every week, you would read a situation where a terrorist would go into a school or into a business or on a street or a mall and pull out machine guns and fire at citizens in those cases. You don't observe that anymore. In fact, you saw a huge drop-off in that occurring in the early 70s in Israel. And there's a reason for that, I think, and that is the big liberalization of people being able to carry concealed handguns at that time in Israel. You can read some news accounts from the early 70s where terrorists would complain that nobody had warned them that citizens would be carrying concealed handguns. Cases where people would go into a mall, pull out their machine gun, and find the little ladies around them pulling pistols out of their purses and blowing away the terrorists there. Now, that doesn't mean it's all hunky-dory. I mean, one of the things one could go and argue is that maybe they've switched to bombings more as a result of that. And so one would want to go and see how the changes in bombings have occurred. And one can talk about that with regard to the United States experience. But one of the few shootings that have occurred in Israel recently, I think illustrates, is kind of the exception that proves the rule here. On March 13th, 97, 7 young Israeli girls were shot to death by a Jordanian soldier while visiting Jordan's so-called Island of Peace. According to the LA Times, quote, the Israelis had complied with Jordanian requests to leave their weapons behind them when they entered the border enclave. Otherwise, they might have been able to stop the shooting, several parents said, end quote. Now, in the United States, we've often also had the adoption of concealed handgun laws coinciding with some of these shootings. And I mentioned before, I got to talk to some of the people in these shootings, and one of the people that I talked to was a woman who was involved in the Luby's Cafeteria shooting in Killeen, Texas. It's a fairly moving story. She lost both of her parents there. Her father had tried to charge the shooter when the shooter's back was turned with a butter knife, got within about 10 feet before he was killed. And her mom then ran to the aid of her dying father there and was cradling him when the gunman came over and blew her away. And this woman was only yards away when she witnessed both of her father and her mother being killed. But one of the things that happened was, and one of the reasons why the Killeen shooting has resulted in some states passing these right-to-carry laws, is that this woman was an expert marksman. She had been illegally carrying a concealed handgun up until about a week before the shooting because of concern for her own safety and crime that she faced. And in fact, the morning of the shooting, she had gone target practice shooting, and she was walking into the restaurant and realized that she had the gun in her purse. And right before she went in, she went back to her car, locked the pistol in the glove box of her car, and then went back in with her mom and dad into the restaurant. And about 10 minutes after they went in, this madman came barreling through the plate glass windows of the restaurant and started shooting. And she could see her car through the broken plate glass windows of the restaurant about 30 yards away. But other people who were trying to run out the front of the restaurant were being killed, and she realized that she would too if she tried to go out and retrieve her gun. It took about 25 minutes between when the first shots were fired at the restaurant and when the police finally arrived in that case. And to me, one of the interesting things that I found in my study here is the number of times where shootings like this, the Killeen one, were stopped by citizens with concealed handguns, but how infrequently they get news coverage. I document several very recent ones in my book, but let me just briefly mention a couple that really haven't gotten much publicity at all. We know about the school shootings that happened last year, but one thing that people don't know is how in several of those 5 cases they were stopped long before the police arrived by citizens with guns. You had the Pearl, Mississippi shooting, the first one of the shootings in which 2 students were killed, in which when the shooting started, the assistant principal at the school, who had a pistol in his car, ran all the way out to his car. He had parked the car well off of school property in order to obey the new 1995 law that you don't have a gun within 1,000 feet of the school. Got his gun, ran all the way back, pointed at the shooter as the shooter was leaving, apparently to go to another school and do a shooting there. Ordered the shooter to the ground and held him there for about 4.5 minutes before the police arrived. In the Edinburgh shooting in Pennsylvania last spring, in which a science teacher was killed, a passerby, hearing the shooting, went in, pointed his gun at the shooter when he was just finishing reloading his revolver, ordered him to the ground, and held him there for over 11 minutes before the police arrived. And I think this illustrates something that I mentioned before about the asymmetry in terms of news coverage, and that is, if you go and do a news search, let's say on either of these shootings, the Pearl, Mississippi shooting, for example, you'll find easily hundreds. You'll find about 687 news hits within the 1 month after the shooting incident occurred. You'll only find 2 of those 687 news stories, though, that mention how the shooting ended. One was at 4 a.m. the following morning on ABC News, and the other one was on early prime the next afternoon on CNN. I can give you examples where bombings were stopped with citizens with concealed handguns and so on, but it's interesting how these types of cases rarely make the local news. But if the bombing had been successful, or if a shooting had occurred and hadn't been stopped by a citizen there, my guess, unfortunately, is that those cases would have made national news coverage. Now, there's lots of anecdotal stories that one can give on this. I just thought I'd show you a few brief numbers before I end it here. And the book has data up through 92. I've since done some work with Bill Landis, who's with me here at the University of Chicago Law School, that looks at multiple victim shootings from 1977 through 1995. So it's and we've looked at it in some ways that I didn't look at in the original work. And what you find is really dramatic. I've never found these types of results in any other type of research that I've done. And the work that I've done with Bill is even more dramatic than the initial estimates that I talk about in the book. But if you look at just those states that changed their concealed handgun laws to see what's the rate at which these multiple victim public shootings occur before and after the passage of these concealed handgun laws, you see about a 90% drop in the rate at which people are killed from multiple victim public shootings before and after the passage of these laws, and over an 80% drop in injuries that have occurred over that period of time. And even the averages before and after, I think, don't do justice to the size of the impacts here, because essentially if you just take the average before and after, you kind of miss how dramatically the changes are occurring over time. If you look before, and this is the probability that there's going to be a death or an injury from a multiple victim public shooting in a state, you see before the concealed handgun laws are go into effect. This is going up. It's not quite a straight line if you're able to look at it closely. Right at the time that these laws get passed, it starts to fall. And the size of the drop increases over time as you have a greater percentage of the adult population having these concealed handguns. As I say, I don't think I've ever found this dramatic of an effect before. And one of the things that's interesting is that it's the only thing that seems to impact these crimes. Higher arrest rates, higher conviction rates, the death penalty, the execution rate. Even though those types of things may affect the overall murder rate, they don't seem to affect this particular type of heinous crime. Other types of gun control laws like waiting periods and background checks seem to also have absolutely no effect on the rate at which these types of crimes occur. Now, I know you all must have some questions, and I appreciate you waiting so patiently while I've talked here, but I'd be very happy to take any questions that people have. Yes, sir?
Australia just restrict, I guess, within the last couple of years, enacted much more restrictive gun laws. What's been their experience in terms of the effect on...
Well, a lot of things were promised, obviously, as a result of that increased, those increased gun restrictions and outlawing many types of guns. But what you've actually observed has been an increase in murder rates, increase in robbery rates. And one of the things that's increased very dramatically in Australia after the change there has been an increase in home break-ins while the residents are in the dwelling. One thing that's very dramatic, if you look across countries, is what's known as the hot burglary rate. In the United States, and these are burglaries that occur while the residents are in the dwelling. In the United States, the hot burglary rate's about 13%. In Canada, it's in the low 40s. In Britain, it's about 58%. And one thing, if you survey American burglars, what you find is that they spend about twice as long casing a dwelling before they break in as compared to their counterparts in these other countries. And when you ask them, why do you spend so long trying to make sure nobody's in the home before you break in, the number one reason that American burglars give is that they're worried about being shot. In Britain, that's not an answer that comes up very frequently there. Somebody else have a question?
What about Chicago and Hyde Park? There was an article in the Tribune yesterday or today on this very subject. I can't remember the article, but one point I remember was that we do have handgun restrictions, but that there's been a freeze on it for like 16 years. So over a period of 16 years, nobody has registered a gun.
Well, handguns, right.
No one, not security
Yeah.
officers are the only ones.
Right. Since 1982 in Chicago, regular citizens have not been able to go and register new handguns to keep in their home in the city. You can register rifles. But Chicago, you're right, has one of the strictest gun control laws in the country. And you could get grandfathered in if you had a handgun and you registered it in 1982 when the law started there, you were allowed to keep your handgun. But you're right, no new handgun ownership has been allowed.
So I mean the police and the officials are satisfied with that?
No. Well, Chicago now has the highest absolute number of murders in the country, but I'm not sure I'd want to go and just attribute it only to that. But my belief is that, you know, a lot of people, they see a problem, crime committed with guns, and they think, well, what's the most direct way of trying to solve that problem? So let's eliminate the guns that are there. The problem is they don't see the consequences that may result from that. They don't observe the fact, or they don't think about all the times that guns are used to prevent crimes from happening. And you may end up getting unintended consequences as a result of that. I think the mayor and others are well-intentioned when they go and support those types of laws. But I think...
Too simplistic. That's what I find. That our public officials are too simplistic and archaic, you know. And they won't ignore the conventional wisdom and go with what they've done for 50 years. And this is what motivates them. They say, well, we've always done it this way. In order to change it, you're going to have to and the mayor is going to sue the gun owners.
Right.
Now, what is that? You know,
That's politics.
I mean, the gun manufacturer.
Right. Yes, sir.
Well, people that are in the public office often say that the decline in the crime rate is a result of the population being older. And as you mentioned, these violent crimes are committed mostly by young males. And they say, well, the reason that the crime rate's down is because the population gets older. The other thing they say is because of draconian new sentencing guidelines that they're putting, the bad people are staying in jail longer times. Does that not confuse your data? Didn't those come about the same time these right to carry guns came in? And doesn't that kind of affect the statistics?
Right, well, I take into account changing demographics, the age profile. I take into account penalties, the arrest rate, the conviction rate, prison sentence lengths. And what I find is strong evidence that increased law enforcement does impact the crime rate. In fact, it's probably the most important factor that affects the crime rate. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But in addition to that, you find drops over and above the national drops that you can explain with harsher penalties for those states that allow citizens to go and carry concealed handguns. And one of the nice things with this data is that by looking across the entire country for 18 years, you can take advantage of the fact that you have so many different states that are passing these laws in different years. So you have Maine in 85, Florida in 87, you have other states in 88, 89, 90, 91. You have states more recently that have passed it. And what you can look at is to see, you know, if all the states were to pass their concealed handgun laws at the same time, it'd be very difficult to disentangle whether it was the concealed handgun laws that were impacting this or something else that might have been occurring at the national level. But because you can go and trace the crime rates before and after in all these different states that changed it over all these different years, the more different changes that you have in different years, it's easier to disentangle other factors that might be changing at the same time.
Well, I was just wondering about the other factor that you just mentioned. Would it not be likely true that the right to carry guns legislation came in about the same time as the draconian sentencing, and that even though you have different states, might in each state the explanation of the increase be because of the tougher sentencing?
Well, I mean, you can go and observe. I mean, I used to work at the Sentencing Commission. The federal sentencing guidelines went into effect in 87, okay, the end of 87. And you had, around the same time, Florida passed its right to carry laws. But you had other states that were changing their laws in different years that didn't coincide with, for example, the changes in the federal sentencing statutes. Or you had you can go and see some states may have adopted their concealed handgun laws at the same time that they increased the penalties, and others didn't. If all of them changed, let's say in 87, when you were having the federal change in sentencing, but they didn't. If all of them changed at the same time, it would be very difficult to try to disentangle what the different effects are going to be there. But there's so much different evidence that we have here. We have, for example, we can see that the drop in violent crimes corresponds very closely with the percent of the adult population that is issued these permits. Those states that issued the most permits had the biggest drops in violent crimes. We can see changes across different crime categories. Okay, so it's not merely the fact that we're increasing prison sentences. That's not going to explain necessarily why people commit fewer robberies and maybe switch into larceny. Or it's not going to explain necessarily why I see a drop in violent crime rates in my own area and an increase in border counties and neighboring states that don't have right to carry laws. And so you have to try to account for those factors, those alternative stories. Otherwise, I don't think it would be very convincing. And as I say, I think my study here accounts for more alternative factors by far than any other study. I'll just give you one comparison that you can make here. The largest previous study on gun control that's been done looked at 170 cities within 1 year, 1980. Okay, so that would say you have 170 observations. Well, that's a pretty small sample. You can't have control for more factors than you have observations to go and try to explain. And by comparison with my study, I have about 52,000 observations. I have these 3,000 plus counties by year for 18 years. And that allows me to control for hundreds of more factors than people have been able to control for in previous studies.
Well, I think the presentation has been interesting. I spent a lot of time at 26 and Cal. I don't accept your premise, but I am sort of moved to think about it a lot. I don't know if it's why I don't feel that way. I mean, I see lots of anecdotal, I've had lots of anecdotal experience that indicate to me that guns are a bad thing and that we ought to outlaw them. And I find this very interesting.
Well, I mean,
I'm
I
not
can.
persuaded, however.
Well, you know, I know my views have changed a lot over time on guns, and we hear constantly, we're bombarded in the news media with the bad things that happen. I assume, you know, I believed a lot of these myths as much as the next guy did before I started looking at these things carefully. And, but I think we're all concerned about the bottom line, and that is whether we can save lives or not. What types of actions can we take that can save lives? And the only way we can answer that is by taking a step back from the anecdotal stories there and trying to look at the hard data and try to measure what happens to the number of lives saved or lost. Yeah, you had a question?
Yeah, apart from your data, do you have any ideas or thoughts about the strength of the anti-gun attack, the demonizing of gun owners, of the NRA, of all of this, and the huge amounts of money that have been available in the anti-gun campaign? I just wondered if you had some thoughts about that.
Well, I think that's kind of beyond my expertise in many ways. I mean, the one thing I can say is my biggest concern that I touched on earlier is that a lot of these myths that are out there, I think, endanger people's lives. I mean, people may be well-meaning about saying you should behave passively when you're confronted by a criminal, but I think it's dangerous not to tell people what's behind those numbers, okay, and to say there are types of active resistance which are riskier than passive behavior, but there's also types of active resistance which are much safer than passive behavior. And just to lump everything together there, I think will make it so people make mistakes. And that, if it kills people, I think that would be sad. And so the question we have to try to deal with here, I think, is to, when somebody makes a claim, is to look at it and to see what the evidence shows with regard to it. That's what I feel most comfortable trying to do on this. And the types of questions you're asking, maybe we can leave to a political scientist or somebody to try to deal with. But it's outside my area of expertise, yeah.
Well, listening to you go over the evidence behind some of these claims, I was struck by how empty of evidence some of them were, particularly the one about much more likely that a gun in the home will be used by the owner or someone in the household against someone else in the household rather than an invader. How shabby the case for the evidence underlying that claim actually was. And you expressed puzzlement on why there is so little interest in actually looking at the facts at one point, and invited in the question session a comment as to why that would be so. Well, the lack of interest in the evidence almost speaks for itself. There is no interest in the actual facts on the part of individuals pushing a gun prohibitionist agenda.
I mean, I guess I disagree. I think that I think people in this debate are well-meaning. I think, as I've said lots of times tonight, I think people on both sides, nobody wants to go and get a law passed if it's going to endanger people's lives. I think, unfortunately, not everybody's looked at the data carefully. Maybe they don't think it's necessary. Maybe they feel that they have enough anecdotal evidence in order to justify their conclusion. But I wouldn't want, I think it's dangerous to go and ascribe motives like that to people, because I just don't see how it's possible that people could go and support those types of rules if they honestly believe that it was going to lead to more deaths.
Well, may I make one comment as a follow-up, or would you rather drop it?
Yeah, I'd rather, we can talk about lots of things, but I'd rather not get into motives for people, yes.
Is that a small percentage of the permits for guns are actually used for crimes, as you expressed earlier? Where do all these criminals get their guns?
Well, I mean, there have been surveys that have been done by the Department of Justice over the years. They indicate that 86% or 87% of guns obtained by criminals were obtained illegally. That percentage has remained relatively constant for a long period of time.
But I mean, illegally in what way? I mean, stolen from gun shops or stolen from people who had permits? Because if you look at these things, then if they're stolen from people who had permits, then the fact that a lot of permits are distributed, you know, results in a lot of stealing of guns.
Well, one thing you could say is if that was going to increase crime over time, if that was the impact, you know, we give people permits, if the guns would get stolen then and then be used in commission crimes, then you might imagine over time then we'd see an upswing then in violent crime rates, and that's not what we observe. But I don't think there's really any evidence to indicate that people who have permits have been losing their guns at any particular rate. But I think that, I mean, they obtain it illegally in many ways, just like you have illegal drugs getting into cities and to other areas. A lot of those guns, they're going to be used in murders by gangs, are going to be obtained in similar ways.
I mean, don't you think that that is something that's certainly quite relevant to this question? Because
Sure.
you basically seem to, you know, give a solution for an existing problem, which is, you know, there's so many guns out there, let's all carry guns, and then we...
No, I wasn't trying to say all of us carry guns.
Well, I'm very globalizing this very much, sorry. But, I mean, have you given any thought in your book maybe about what to do about the problem that there are so many guns out there carried by criminals?
No, I agree. I think that's exactly the right type of question to ask. What I think you need to think about are laws and rules that penalize these bad people from carrying guns. And if you can have rules that do that, that's great. My concern, though, is just to take a step back a little bit and make sure that those are primarily the people that we're going to be punishing with these rules. Because if it's the good people who primarily obey some type of gun control law that you're imposing, so you're making it relatively more difficult for them to own guns relative to the criminals, my concern is that you may accidentally increase the crime rate. Because if you relatively disarm the good people relative to the bad people, then the threats, the risks that the criminals take in committing crimes can actually be reduced. And so that's why I think we need to try to focus on is not, can we find something that makes it difficult for criminals to own guns, but focus on what things can we do that make it relatively more difficult for criminals to own guns or commit a crime with a gun relative to law-abiding citizens.
Can I ask a question? Of the gun owners, of people who own guns, can you break it down and tell me what percentage of these people own guns legally and what percentage illegally?
Well, what I can say is that less than 1% of guns are ever used in the commission of a crime. You have a little bit less than 2% of handguns that are ever used in a commission crime, and quite a bit less than 1% of rifles that are used in commission of crimes. And I mean, that's probably about the closest that one can get at. You know, we don't know, you know,
so
possession.
There's not really that many guns out there illegally.
Well, there are. I mean, I'm sure in an absolute sense there are a fair number, but if you look at relative to the whole stock of guns there are a small percentage of all guns that are there.
Okay, that's a comforting in I'm thinking that if the criminals can really get their hands on guns
They can.
They can.
quickly.
Yeah.
They can.
Yeah.
No, I can't.
While we're thinking about it, they can buy guns.
Yes, you had a question?
Did you make any breakdown in your, particularly you used scenarios about women preventing crimes by brandishing a gun between, I have two questions, between the criminals who came at them with guns and criminals who came at them without guns.
Right. Well, I mean, you can break that down with the National Crime Victimization Survey data, and you find that in either case, the safest course of action for people to take, women or men, is to brandish a gun. And whether the criminal has a gun or some other type of weapon when he comes at them. That the basic, what seems to be happening is that even if the criminal has a gun, you know, if he can find a relatively safer, easier target to go and get where he doesn't face the risk there, he would prefer doing that.
Could you describe the scenario of a woman who, to be concealed, it's got to be somewhere. It's probably in her purse.
Well, there are many places.
Well, okay.
Yeah, I mean, some of them may have it on their skirt or attached to their thigh, or, you know, if they're
Right,
wearing...
and somebody comes up behind you and you know, does that. How are you going to get your gun?
Sure. Well, one of the advantages with guns as compared to something like mace, for example, is that if in many types of attacks you have some warning. You know, somebody's approaching you from across the street or following you for some period of time. With mace, for example, you only have a relatively short distance that it's going to be effective. You have to be concerned about things like wind and other things that are going to be there. You know, if the wind's blowing at you or across as opposed to blowing directly in the face of the person who's doing attack, you know, you're going to be limited there. But what I would say is when you look at the cases, the vast majority of cases, you have some warning before the person actually grabs you that they're going to be attacking. And one of the advantages for guns is that you can go and begin to deter them at a range that you normally couldn't do in the case of something like mace or many other types of weapons that people would have. I mean, if somebody's obviously already grabbed you, you're going to be limited, okay, in terms of what you're going to be able to do. But there are cases where women, I mean, I list cases in my book. I have a lot of footnotes that go through and describe instances where women have been attacked. They may have been knocked down to the ground then and then had a second in order to go and pull out their gun. Cases where a woman may have been attacked in the case of a car hijacking or something like that and broken free for a moment from the person who was attacking and then been able to go and pick up their gun to go and use or brandish against the person who was attacking them in those cases. So I mean, there's a whole range of things. But again, I think one of the big benefits of the gun is you can go and create a distance between yourself and the criminal. This is one thing that I should bring up, and that is the notion of training that you have. I think there's a big difference between the amount of training that somebody has to be a police officer versus being able to use a gun as a citizen. And the big difference is this, is that in the case of being a police officer, you have to be able to use a gun offensively. You have to be able to essentially take the physical contact to the criminal himself. When you're using a gun defensively, what you're trying to do is maximize the distance between yourself and the attacker. There's no reason why you want to try to get into physical contact. The whole point of using a gun there is to try to make it so that the person won't come near you to get into physical contact. I hope that answers your question.
Well, I mean, I understand your point, but I'm just trying to play out the scenario.
Well, sure, there are going to be certain cases.
Then when you do walk down the street with your gun out, it's no longer
Can I just make a quick comment to that? There are lots of handbags, fanny packs that are sold specifically to conceal a concealed gun. I mean, they have Velcro closures, they've got pockets you put your hand in.
Yeah, I think you'd be amazed the number of different places. I was,
Yeah.
that women can have a concealed handgun or a man. But, yes, sir.
Your book's been criticized for using too many counties that have trivial crime rates, and the most important criticism, this is from a journal I've not seen, it's through the computer, but that their strongest criticism was that if you exclude Florida and only include the larger counties, that your case falls apart.
Yeah.
Have you seen that?
Oh, sure. I mean, one of the things I try to do in the book, I have chapter 7 where I go through about, you know, as many objections that were raised at the time when I was writing the book to an initial academic study that I'd done and try to answer them. And one of the ones you're bringing up was one of the ones I spent some time dealing with there. And basically, the point that he's talking about is, one of the claims is that if you eliminate from the data set all counties that have fewer than 100,000 people in them, which is about 86% of the counties in the United States, and in addition eliminate Florida from that, so you're talking about almost 88% of the counties that you've eliminated, then what happens is the impact on crime is still negative across all the different crime categories, but it's no longer statistically significant for the categories of murder and rape, for the one particular type of estimates that they looked at. And I think the easiest way to think about that It's actually, let me give you an example for something like, let's look at murder. When you drop out the counties with fewer than 100,000 people and drop out Florida, what you actually find is that this line becomes steeper over here. It looks something like this, okay? And what they're doing, they only look at the before and after averages. So let's take a simple case where, let's say it was perfectly symmetrical, the increase here and the drop afterwards. If I only looked at the before and after averages, what would be the difference in the average there? There'd be no difference. Would that mean that there's no effect from the concealed handguns on crime? I wouldn't think so, right? Because here it's going up right up until the point in time when the law goes into effect, and then it's falling after that. So all they're doing in that one particular study is looking at just one type of estimate that I had there, the simplest, which just looked at the before and after average. I would argue, actually, that when they drop out all those counties and Florida on top of it, those results are actually even stronger. Okay, it's just because they're only comparing the before and after averages rather than before and after trends that you get that. But even by their own results, I mean, I just would ask you to think this, even if you didn't accept that. I mean, here, you know, they've gone and tried all sorts of different types of combinations of counties and states to go and delete. And it, even doing all that, I mean, you have to ask, well, did they try to drop out Georgia and Texas and all these other states? Here, you know, do they try counties with less than 50,000? Do they try counties with more than 50,000? But this is the final one.
Trivial crime rate.
Right, I know, but the thing is, most of the ones with zero crime rates, you're going to get whatever benefit you're going to get by dropping out counties with like less than 20,000 population. You know, the additional benefit that you get from dropping out counties between 20,000 and 80,000 is fairly trivial. And you know, which states you're going to drop out. And what I would say is, even when they've done that, you're still finding significant drops by their own results in aggravated assaults and robberies, okay? And the effects are negative but not statistically significant in murders and rapes. And so, you know, even in their case, there's no cost of having these laws. And you're still finding some benefits in terms of some of the different crime categories that are there. Well, yeah. Let me get somebody who hasn't asked a question. Are we? Okay. Yeah.
I'd like to make sure about what it is you're not saying. There are countries in the Western world, industrialized and so forth, that have far fewer gun possessions, you know, per capita than we do.
Sure.
You agree with that? If we had their rates of possession, would we be safer?
Well, I can't say if we had zero gun ownership what would happen here in the United States.
Just what you have.
Right. Well, what I will say is, in the United States, we have a lot of variation across states. You have some states where it's about 10% gun ownership. You have other states where maybe it's close to 70% gun ownership within the state. And with regard to concealed handguns, you see a huge range there. You have some counties in the United States where 20% of the adult population has concealed handgun permits. You know, some states where the maximum is about 7%, and others where it's 1% or 0, where it's outlawed and people aren't allowed to have it. And at least over that range, you know, what I can observe in the United States, I feel comfortable. I don't feel comfortable making predictions about what it would be like if we could have a gun ownership rate that's lower than any of the states that I can observe in my sample, okay? It's this concern that academics have for...
If it was as low as Britain, say, or Japan,
well,
we wouldn't be safer, or would we?
Well, I think there's a trade-off here. This is what I will say, because we don't have a gun ownership. There's no state in the United States that has a gun ownership rate as low as the reported gun ownership rate in Japan. So I can't tell you, but I can make a couple points. And one is, what's the cost for us moving to that type of situation? And this gets up to a question that was asked earlier. If we passed a law tomorrow that outlawed guns, who would it primarily initially impact? My guess is it would initially tend to disarm law-abiding citizens relative to criminals. And if there's anything that my research convinces me of, is that at least during that transition period of time where it's the law-abiding citizens are going to be relatively disarmed relative to criminals, you'd actually see an increase in crime rate. That's even if you would eventually get to nirvana that would be out there in terms of eliminating violence. My other concern is that it's not clear that you would get to nirvana, okay? And that is because criminals like to attack victims that they perceive as relatively weak. And the people that I find that benefit the most are people, women, the elderly, people who live in high crime areas. And there's a lot of variation when you look across countries. I mean, I can find countries with very low gun ownership rates reported that have very high murder rates and other crime rates, and the reverse is also true. When you look across all countries, the data is available, it's not really obvious that there's a relationship between gun ownership and crime rates. And let me just point out one other thing, and that is the difficulty with dealing with international data. And one example is, look at the former Soviet Union. And you had a situation where guns were essentially outlawed for a long period of time there. When the former Soviet Union fell, you have these civil wars breaking out in Armenia and other places, which were being essentially fought with guns that were in people's homes, which supposedly they hadn't had for a long period of time. When you go and rely on survey data, the problem that you face is if I go and ask people whether they own a gun in a country where it's illegal for them to own guns, the reported gun ownership rate's likely to be biased downward, might likely be much less than it actually is in those cases. So even when they go and I'm always skeptical about what the reported gun ownership rate in countries are, particularly ones where it's illegal for people to own guns. And so I'm not even sure we can tell really what the gun ownership rate really is in Japan.
Are you skeptical about the reported murder rates?
Well, I'm less skeptical about reported murder rates than I am about reported gun ownership rates. I think it's a lot harder to go and hide a lot of murders that are there than it's going to be harder to hide.
Significant differences?
Well, I think you see huge differences across countries. I just don't think that those differences are correlated with at least the rough measures, the very rough measures that we have in terms of gun ownership. I don't know, that took a little bit longer than I expected. Okay, well, I appreciate you all taking the time to come here tonight. Thank you. I hope you thought I went okay. I probably went longer than anybody had planned.
Everybody who stayed around and wanted to hear it, so as long as you're okay with that, then
okay.
for the crowd. What?
Sure.
Do you have pens?
Yeah, I got pens.
You can sit if you would like.
Okay.
After his talk at 57th Street Books in Chicago, Mr. Lott signed books for members of the audience.
Of gun control and crime. And so I looked into trying to sign some papers. I mean, I knew something about the area, but when I started going through and looking at the studies, there were a couple hundred studies on the topic. I was pretty amazed by how poorly done they were. You know, they're very small samples, often looking at one county or one city or one state over time. And for example, not one previous study on gun control had tried to account for even arrest rates or conviction rates or prison sentence lengths, all things that I think are pretty important to try to control for. And they were all either, what's your name?
John.
Either purely time series or cross-sectional studies. And there are problems that we can talk about with both of those. But, you know, so when you're an academic, one of the things you can do is, if it's not something new that nobody's thought of before, you can do a better job. And so that's basically, I saw an opportunity to maybe do a better job than people had done before, and that's about as deep as it was for getting involved in doing
I have to
it.
wonder, have you had much experience of personal attacks? I don't mean physical, I mean I've heard some people get extremely emotional about you from a database of total ignorance simply because they heard a little of what you'd said and become almost hysterical.
Well, this is an issue that people have, sure, not into that, but people have very strong feelings on this on both sides. And you know, again, one can only try to deal with what's their concern and just try to see what the numbers look like.
The efforts to maintain mythic thinking seem to produce pretty convoluted results.
Well, people feel strongly, but hopefully, yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
What's your name?
Peter Armstrong.
Okay.
Now, like in antecedent evidence, Oak Park, when they declared their handgun ban and their weapons ban, their burglary rate shot up for the next 5 years. And in Florida, with the concealed permit carry, that's when they had the rash of tourist attacks, because criminals knew the license plates that were used by the rental car companies. And
Yeah, they used to have an E at the front of
right,
them.
and they went after them. They specifically went after
Thanks.
tourists. Thank you. Because they were not going to. They don't want to mess with someone with a gun. And I have friends who are state police, Chicago police, and depending on where you live, they will tell you to have a weapon.
Thank you.
Even though it's illegal.
Even though it's illegal,
Irish
yeah.
McRae.
They're saying
What-
Irish
just
McRae.
don't get
Irish? How do you spell that? I-R-I-S-H? Okay,
Yep.
okay.
Take it for what it's worth.
Chicago police officer.
Oh, you are? Okay. Well, thanks for
We're
coming.
doing a paper now, a group of us on gun control. We think that it will
Well, thank you.
deter crime.
Okay.
So that's why.
Okay, well, I appreciate you taking the time to come tonight.
I waited till you signed all the books. Just a quick question.
Can't get you to buy one?
Actually, I have yours.
Okay, I just
bought
was
it-
joking.
I bought it the moment it came out, and it was my mistake to give it to a friend. And
Well, you
I
should
called
buy
him.
one
I
to
called him this morning
Uh-huh.
and said I want my book back because I want it signed, and he said no way, I have it somewhere. So I'm actually pretty mad at him. But I bought
Okay.
the book when it came out.
Okay, well, I appreciate that.
A quick question is, when you work, you explained that if you live in Chicago, you can't register a gun.
Handguns.
Handguns.
Right.
But you can get from the state of Illinois your ownership card.
Right.
And with that card, you can go out of the city and buy a gun.
Right,
And if you bring this gun back into your house, you commit a crime.
that's right.
But do these, where you buy your gun outside the city of Chicago, do they report it to the police?
Well, the police do a background check on you, things like that. I don't think they report the type of gun that you're getting. I mean, it's not a crime for you to go and use the card to go and buy a gun outside the city of Chicago.
Yeah.
I mean, for all they know, maybe you have another residence. You could have a hunting lodge someplace or
And
something.
keep the gun there.
Right, or another residence. So they don't, it's not a crime for you to go and buy it. It'd be a crime for you to take it into the city.
Into the city. And what about rifles are legal?
Rifles are legal. You won't have a problem getting that registered.
And where would I register?
Well, you'd have to go through the city. I haven't
Yeah,
registered
just-
myself in the city, but I'm sure if you called up the city police and asked them, they could tell you.
Okay, they would let you register.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Sure, no, thanks for coming.
Could you sign some for the store too?
Sure, I'd be happy to.
One for me also.
Okay, thanks. And what's your name?
John Lott was the chief economist at the U.S. Sentencing Commission for 2 years in the late 1980s, and now teaches law and economics at the University of Chicago. His book, More Guns, Less Crime, is published by the University of Chicago Press. You can find more information about the book on their website, uchicago.edu.